The golden hue of sunset draped over Manhattan, turning the glass-covered skyscrapers into glowing embers. The city pulled me forward, the hum of traffic and distant chatter filling my ears as I stepped out of Grand Central Station. My fingers clenched the handle of my travel bag, my thoughts preoccupied with the business trip that awaited me in Chicago the following morning. Then, out of nowhere, someone blocked my path. I stopped mid-step. A woman stood before me, hesitant, as if she weren't sure whether to speak or turn away. The light from the street lamps barely revealed her face, but there was something familiar about the way she held herself. A pause, a slight breath before she finally spoke. "Jake, from River North, Chicago?" Her voice hit me like a brick. The years melted away, the present slipping through my fingers like sand. My heart lurched against my ribs, caught between disbelief and something deeper, something I hadn't let myself feel in decades. I swallowed hard. "Sophie." She smiled, a small, uncertain curve of her lips. "I was wondering if it was really you." For a moment, I couldn't move. The streets of New York blurred around me. I was back in Chicago, in that old house on a cold autumn evening, hearing her laughter spill through the walls. The scent of rain on concrete, the distant murmur of the radio playing from her window. 20 years. 20 years, and yet here she was, standing right in front of me. "You," I started, but my voice caught. Sophie tilted her head slightly, studying me. "You still have the same expression when you're surprised." I let out a breath of disbelief. "And you still say the most unexpected things." Her eyes softened. "Do you have time?" I glanced at my watch out of instinct, but the numbers meant nothing. Of course I had time. How could I not? She must have seen the answer in my face, because she nodded down the street. "I own a cafe a few blocks from here. Come by." I exhaled sharply, nodding. Yeah, I'd like that." We started walking together, a strange, quiet rhythm forming between us. "You're in New York now?" I asked after a moment. She smiled slightly. "Have been for a while. Moved here maybe 15 years ago." 15. So that meant after she left Chicago. I wanted to ask so many things. Had she been happy? Had life treated her well? Did she ever think about the past? About me? But instead, I just walked beside her, letting the cool night air settle between us. The cafe was small, tucked between a bookstore and a wine bar. A faded wooden sign above the door read Dandelion Breeze. The name stirred something in my memory, but before I could place it, Sophie was already unlocking the door and flipping the closed sign to face the street. Inside, the air smelled of vanilla and roasted coffee beans. The lighting was dim, casting long shadows over the wooden tables. The place had a quiet charm, intimate and personal, much like the woman who owned it. She shrugged off her coat, revealing the same black dress she had been wearing at the station. Around her neck, a silver chain dangled, a small charm shaped like a heart resting against her collarbone. "Sit anywhere," she said, disappearing behind the counter. I chose a seat near the window. The street outside was still busy. Taxis rushing by, couples walking hand in hand, people lost in their own worlds. Sophie returned with 2 glasses and a bottle of bourbon. She placed them on the table and poured us each a drink. "So," she said, sliding into the seat across from me, 20 years. I let out a small laugh. "Yeah, 20 years." She raised her glass. "To old memories." I hesitated, then clinked my glass against hers. "To old memories." The bourbon burned as it slid down my throat, but it was a welcome warmth. Sophie watched me over the rim of her glass. "You still drink bourbon. And you still know that." She smiled but didn't respond. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken words. I cleared my throat. So, you own a cafe now? She nodded. Yeah. I never planned on it, but life doesn't always go as planned, does it? I scoffed. No, it doesn't. Her fingers traced the edge of her glass. And you? What do you do? Journalism, I said. I work for a magazine. Her eyebrows lifted. You always liked writing. I smiled. I guess I did. A pause. Then, softly, she asked, Did you ever go back to Chicago? The question held weight. I exhaled. Once or twice. But never long enough to. I don't know. It never felt like home after you left. Her eyes flickered, just for a second. I see. We fell into another silence. The air between us buzzed with things left unsaid. Finally, I spoke. Why did you leave, Sophie? She exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around her glass. Because I had to. That's not an answer. She met my gaze. It's the only one I can give. I studied her, the woman who had once been my entire world. There was something unreadable in her eyes, something that made me want to reach across the table and shake the truth out of her. But I didn't, because I knew Sophie. She never said anything before she was ready. So instead, I poured us another drink. All right, I said, leaning back. Tell me what you can. She looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. And finally she began. The first time I saw her. Chicago, 1991. The wind howled through the narrow streets, rattling the loose windows of old brick buildings. I was 17, and the world felt both too small and too big at the same time. My uncle's house was on the northern edge of River North, near where the city blurred into something quieter, something less polished than the glossy skyscrapers downtown. I was living with him and his wife, my aunt, while finishing my last year of high school. My parents had decided this arrangement would be good for me, a chance to focus on my studies, away from the distractions of home. But all it did was make me feel trapped. The house itself was an old two-story rental with a smaller unit attached in the back. The kind of place with creaky floors, a radiator that groaned in the winter, and a front porch that leaned a little too far forward. The first time I saw her, she was sitting on that porch. It was late September. The air smelled like burning leaves and rain-soaked pavement. I had just gotten home from school when I noticed someone new outside the rental unit. She was sitting on the wooden steps, long legs stretched out in front of her, a cigarette resting between her fingers. She wasn't smoking it, just rolling it absently between her thumb and forefinger. Her hair was dark brown, cut just past her shoulders, and there was something about the way she sat, relaxed but distant, like she was both there and somewhere else entirely. She looked up when I stepped through the gate. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then, she tilted her head slightly, squinting at me like she was trying to place my face. You live here? She asked. Her voice was smooth, lower than I expected. I nodded. Yeah. You renting the back place? She smirked. I guess that makes us neighbors. I shifted awkwardly. She looked older than me, maybe early 20s. But there was something youthful about her, something almost unfinished. I cleared my throat. I'm Jake. She exhaled softly, looking out toward the street. Sophie. She didn't offer anything else. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable, just strange. Finally, she nodded toward the house. Your uncle's kind of a hard-ass, huh? I huffed a small laugh. Yeah. You met him? Briefly. She flicked her cigarette. Didn't leave the best impression. I snorted. Join the club. That made her smile, just a little. Then, before I could say anything else, she stood, brushing her hands against her jeans. Well, see you around, Jake. And with that, she disappeared inside. It didn't happen right away. At first, Sophie and I only crossed paths in passing. She came and went at odd hours, slipping through the backyard gate with a quiet kind of presence. Sometimes I'd hear her music through the walls, soft, melancholic tunes that made the space between us feel even heavier. Then one night everything changed. It was late, past midnight. I was sitting on the back steps, staring up at the sky. The city didn't offer many stars, just a dull orange haze stretching across the skyline. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just breathing, just existing. Then, the door behind me creaked open. I turned. Sophie stood there in an oversized sweater, arms wrapped around herself. Her hair was slightly damp, curling at the ends. She hesitated, then stepped outside, sitting down a few feet away from me. Neither of us spoke at first. Then, after a long moment, she sighed. "You ever feel like you don't belong anywhere?" The question caught me off guard. I glanced at her. Her profile was illuminated by the glow of the street lamp, casting shadows under her eyes. "Yeah," I admitted. "All the time." She nodded slightly, as if she already knew my answer. For a while, we just sat there, the silence thick between us. Then, out of nowhere, she laughed, this small, breathy sound, like she couldn't believe something. "What?" I asked. She shook her head. "Nothing. Just, I barely know you, and yet I feel like I do." I swallowed. "Yeah, same." Another beat of silence. Then, she looked over at me, her gaze steady. "You got a girlfriend, Jake?" I nearly choked. "What? No." She smirked, amused. "Figures." I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" She shrugged, looking back at the street. "You just seem like the type." "The type for what?" "The type who falls in love too fast." I scoffed. "You don't even know me." She gave me this look, like she was seeing right through me. "Sure I do," she murmured. And for some reason, the way she said it made my pulse race. One evening, maybe a month later, I came home to find Sophie sitting on the porch again. Only this time, she wasn't holding a cigarette. She was crying. It was the first time I had ever seen her like that, her shoulders hunched, her hands clasped together like she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. I hesitated at the gate, unsure if I should walk past or say something. She must have heard me because she wiped at her face quickly, forcing a weak smile. "Hey," she muttered. I stepped closer. "You okay?" She laughed bitterly. "Yeah, just a long day." I didn't believe her, but I didn't push. Instead, I sat down beside her, letting the cold wind settle around us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, out of nowhere, she whispered, "Jake, do you ever feel like you've made too many mistakes to start over?" The question twisted something in my chest. I glanced at her, her face barely visible in the dim light. "Sophie," I said quietly, "you're 23. She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I feel older than that," she murmured. I wanted to say something, to tell her that whatever had happened, whatever had hurt her, she wasn't beyond saving. But I didn't know how. So instead, I did the only thing I could. I reached over, took her hand, and held it. She didn't pull away. And for the first time since I had met her, she looked at me like I was someone she could trust. The first time I touched her. Autumn deepened in Chicago, and the air grew sharper, carrying the scent of burning leaves and distant rain. Sophie and I had settled into something unspoken, a rhythm neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. I would come home late from school or my part-time job at the bookstore, and she'd be there, on the porch in the backyard, sometimes sitting on the stairs just inside her door, as if waiting for someone she'd never admit she wanted to see. She never asked if I wanted to sit with her. And I never asked if she wanted me to leave. That night, it was raining. Not hard, just a soft, steady drizzle that made the streetlights glow like melted gold. I had stayed late at the bookstore, reading more than I was shelving, and by the time I got home, my jacket was damp from the walk. I almost didn't see her. She was sitting on the back porch steps, her arms wrapped around her knees, hair wet from the rain. I hesitated. "You're gonna catch a cold," I said, stepping toward her. She lifted her head slightly, offering me a small, tired smile. "I like the rain." I exhaled. "You like tempting pneumonia?" She chuckled, but didn't argue. I took my jacket off and draped it over her shoulders before sitting down beside her. For a long time, we just listened to the rain. Then, quietly, she said, "I think I'm leaving soon." Something in my chest tightened. "Leaving?" She nodded slowly. "My lease is up in a couple of months. Thought I might move somewhere warmer. Maybe California." I stared at the wet pavement, my pulse hammering. "California, huh?" She smiled faintly. "You ever been?" I shook my head. "No." "You?" "Nope." She exhaled. "But I like the idea of it. Palm trees. Beaches. A fresh start." A fresh start. I hated how that sounded. I swallowed. "So that's it? You're just gonna pick up and go?" She turned to me then, her eyes unreadable. Would it matter if I stayed? The question sent a shockwave through me. I should have said no. Should have laughed it off. Should have pretended none of this mattered, that she was just some neighbor, just some woman I barely knew. But I didn't. Instead, I said, yeah, it would." A beat passed. Then, before I could stop myself, I reached over and took her hand. Her fingers were ice cold, but she didn't pull away. The rain fell heavier, but neither of us moved. And for the first time, I let myself admit, if only silently, how deep I was already in. I don't know when it started, when the tension between us became something undeniable. Maybe it was the way our conversations grew quieter, like we were afraid to say too much. Maybe it was the way I started noticing things I shouldn't, how the hollow of her throat moved when she swallowed, how her fingers toyed with the hem of her sleeve when she was nervous, how she smelled faintly of vanilla and smoke. Or maybe it was the way she looked at me, like I was something dangerous, something she wanted anyway. That night, I was in my room, staring at my unfinished homework, when I heard a knock. Soft. Hesitant. I opened the door. Sophie stood there, barefoot, wearing an oversized sweater that slid off one shoulder. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she exhaled. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, and she slipped past me. She didn't sit. She just stood there, her arms crossed, like she was holding herself together. "I had a dream about you," she murmured. My pulse spiked. "A dream?" I repeated. She nodded. "We were somewhere else. Somewhere quiet." "And you?" She stopped, exhaling sharply. "It doesn't matter." But it did. It mattered because she was here, because her voice was shaking, because I could see the war happening inside her. "Sophie," I said softly. She turned to me, and before I knew what was happening, she was kissing me. Not soft, not hesitant, like she had been holding herself back for too long and couldn't anymore. I barely had time to react before my back hit the wall, her hands fisting in my shirt. I should have stopped it, should have pulled away, should have remembered that she was older, that she was leaving, that nothing about this could end well. But I didn't, because she was Sophie and I was 17, and nothing had ever felt so inevitable. I don't know how long we stood there. Long enough for the air between us to turn electric. Long enough for my hands to find her waist, for her fingers to thread into my hair, for both of us to forget the reasons why this was a bad idea. When she finally pulled away, her breathing was unsteady. "Jake," she whispered, like she wanted to warn me. like she wanted to stop. But I didn't want her to. I rested my forehead against hers. Tell me to stop, and I will. She closed her eyes. But she didn't say a word. I kissed her again. This time, she didn't hesitate. We fell onto the bed, tangled in each other, hands grasping, clothes disappearing between gasps. Her skin was warm, her breath hot against my neck, and all I could think was, this is happening. This is real. I didn't think about the morning. I didn't think about what came next. I only thought about her. And for one night, we let ourselves forget everything else. Hourglass not done the aftermath. The sun was barely rising when I woke up. Sophie was still beside me, curled on her side, her breathing soft and even. I watched her for a long time, memorizing the curve of her shoulder, the way her fingers twitched slightly in sleep. I didn't know what this meant, didn't know what would happen when she woke up. All I knew was that I didn't want her to leave. But people like Sophie, people who carried ghosts in their eyes and goodbyes on their lips, they never stayed. And deep down, I already knew this wasn't the beginning.
It was the start of the end.
The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind. The heavy kind. The kind that made the air thick, like something had already changed before I could even figure out what it was. Sophie was sitting on the edge of the bed, wrapped in the blanket, her back turned to me. I pushed myself up slowly, my head still hazy, my body still remembering the warmth of her against me just hours ago. For a moment, I just watched her. Then, carefully, I reached out, letting my fingers brush against her bare shoulder. She flinched. Not much. Just enough. Enough for my stomach to twist. She turned slightly, but not enough to meet my eyes. You awake? I swallowed hard.
Yeah.
She exhaled, tightening the blanket around herself. I should go. Her voice was quiet, careful, like she was already trying to put distance between us. Panic flared in my chest. Sophie. Jake. She sighed, finally looking at me. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes, those eyes that had always held secrets, looked even more distant now, like she was already gone. This was, she started, then stopped, running a hand through her hair. I sat up fully. Don't say it was a mistake. She closed her eyes for a second. I wasn't going to. I studied her carefully, searching for something, anything, that would tell me what she was thinking. What were you going to say? I asked. She hesitated. Then, softly, too softly, she whispered, "It can't happen again." The words felt like a punch to the ribs. I shook my head. Sophie. Jake. She forced a small, sad smile. I'm leaving. We both knew this was never going to be something that lasts. I clenched my jaw. It doesn't have to be nothing. She let out a slow breath, standing up, wrapping the blanket tighter around her as she turned away. That's exactly what it has to be.
I didn't say anything.
Because I didn't know how to fight her on this. Because a part of me knew she had already made up her mind. After that night, something shifted. She was still there, still in the back apartment, still on the porch some nights, still in the same spaces as me. But she wasn't the same. She had walls now, walls I hadn't even noticed were missing before. She still talked to me, still gave me small smiles, still laughed at my stupid jokes when I tried too hard. But she never let me get too close. And I, stupid, reckless, 17-year-old me, kept trying anyway. One night, a week after everything, I found her sitting on the back steps again, staring up at the sky. I sat down beside her, close but not touching. She didn't look at me. For a long time, we just sat there in silence. Then, softly, she said, "Do you ever think about leaving?" The question threw me. Leaving? She nodded. Chicago. Your uncle's house. All of it. I shrugged. I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. She exhaled. You should. I frowned. Why? She finally turned to me, her expression unreadable. Because you don't belong here. I blinked. And you do. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes.
No.
That's why I'm leaving. I clenched my jaw. You don't have to. She laughed softly. Jake. No, I mean it, I said, my voice rawer than I wanted it to be. What if you stayed? She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a second, just a second, I saw something crack in her. But then she shook her head. And I knew this was a battle I was never going to win. As the weeks passed, she started packing. It was slow at first, a few things disappearing from the shelves, a couple of boxes stacked in the corner. But then it picked up. And suddenly, her apartment didn't look like hers anymore. The night before she left, I knocked on her door. She hesitated before opening it. Her place was almost empty now. Just a couple of suitcases, a half-packed box, the ghost of everything that had ever made it hers. I swallowed hard. So, this is it? She nodded, leaning against the doorframe. Something inside me cracked. I exhaled sharply. Do you even care? Her expression flickered, just for a second. Jake. Because I do, I said, stepping closer. I care, Sophie. I care so much, and I don't understand how you can just. She closed her eyes. Jake, please. Just tell me the truth, I demanded. Did I ever mean anything to you? Her breath hitched. She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw it, the thing she had been hiding.
Pain.
Regret. And something dangerously close to love. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. And that was all the answer I needed, because if it had been nothing, she would have said so. Instead, she just whispered, "Goodbye, Jake." And then she shut the door. The next morning, I didn't go to school. I stood at my window, watching as she loaded the last of her things into the back of a taxi. She didn't look up.
She didn't look for me.
She just got in, closed the door, and disappeared. And just like that, she was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the empty street. But I do know this. I had never felt more alone in my life. New York was loud. Even at night, the streets buzzed with energy, headlights cutting through the darkness, neon signs flickering against the buildings. I had gotten used to it. It had been years since I'd left Chicago, years since I had last stood on that porch, years since I had watched her disappear into the back of a taxi. I had moved on. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Now, I was here, Jake Miller, journalist, columnist, writer for one of the biggest newspapers in the country, but some nights, when the city slowed just enough for me to think, I still felt 17. 17, waiting for someone who was never going to come back. I had buried that part of me, or at least I thought I had, until the night I saw her again. I was at a small bar in Manhattan, meeting an old friend from college. The kind of place where the lighting was dim, the music was low, and the whiskey tasted smoother than it should for the price. I was nursing my drink, half listening to my friend ramble about work, when I saw her.
Sophie.
At first, I thought I was imagining it. It had been 20 years. 20 years since that night. 20 years since she shut the door in my face. But there she was, sitting at the bar, her fingers curled around a wine glass, her hair a little shorter, her features a little older, but still her. For a moment, I just stared. Then, as if she could feel my eyes on her, she turned. And when our gazes met, I knew she remembered me, too. For a long time, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, she set down her glass, picked up her purse, and made her way toward me. My friend was still talking, oblivious, but I didn't hear a word. All I could hear was my own heartbeat, hammering against my ribs like it was 17 again, like none of the years between us had ever passed. She stopped in front of me, tilting her head slightly. "Jake Miller," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "Of all places." I swallowed, my throat dry. "Sophie." A slow smile tugged at her lips. "You gonna invite me to sit?" I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to shake off the shock. "Yeah, of course. Please." My friend, finally catching on, glanced between us before awkwardly excusing himself. Sophie slid into the seat across from me, folding her hands together. For a long time, we just looked at each other. Neither of us spoke. Then, finally, I broke the silence. "You still drink red wine." She smirked. "And you still drink whiskey." A beat passed. Then, "What the hell are you doing in New York?" She chuckled. "I live here. Have for a while." That caught me off guard. "You do?" She nodded. "And you? Don't tell me you're still in Chicago." I huffed a small laugh.
Nah.
"Been here for a few years now. Work brought me here." "Journalism, right?" she said, studying me. The fact that she knew that, remembered that, sent something sharp through my chest. "Yeah," I said. "And you?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "I run a small cafe in Brooklyn. Nothing fancy." A cafe. Somehow, I could picture it. "Didn't see that coming," I admitted. She smirked. Neither did I. Another beat of silence. And then, "Did you ever make it to California?" Her smile faltered, just for a second. Then she shook her head.
No.
I arched a brow. "Why not?" She exhaled, looking down at her wine glass. "I don't know. I guess I kept thinking I'd go eventually. But life happened." I didn't ask what that meant. Because I already knew. We talked for hours. At first, it was the safe things, our careers, our lives, the places we had been, the people we had become. But then, as the night deepened, the questions got closer. Heavier. "What happened after you left?" I finally asked. She took a slow sip of her wine. "A lot." I waited. Then, quietly, she said, "I got married." My stomach twisted. I didn't know why it surprised me. 20 years had passed. Of course, she had a life. Of course, she had someone. Still, it stung. She must have seen something on my face because she smiled faintly. "It didn't last." I swallowed. "Divorced?" She nodded. 5 years ago." Another silence stretched between us. I wanted to ask more. Who he was, what happened, if she loved him the way she once made me feel like she could have loved me. But I didn't. Because then she asked, "And you?" I let out a breath. "Never married." She raised a brow. "Never." I smirked, but it didn't quite reach my eyes. Guess I was waiting for something. She held my gaze. Something flickered there. Something dangerous. Then, softly, she said, "Jake." I shook my head. Don't.
Don't say it."
Her lips parted slightly.
But she didn't say anything.
Because we both knew. We both knew what this was. And what it still wasn't. By the time we left the bar, the city was quieter. She walked with me to the curb, hands in her pockets, her breath visible in the cold air. I wanted to ask if I'd see her again. Wanted to ask if this was just a coincidence or something more. But instead, I just said, "It was good seeing you." She smiled. "You too." A beat of silence. Then, before I could stop myself, "Did you ever regret it?" She exhaled. "Regret what?" "Leaving." A pause. Then, softly, she said, "I regretted hurting you." That wasn't the answer I wanted. But maybe it was the only answer she could give. A taxi pulled up beside her. She hesitated. Then, suddenly, before I could process it, she leaned in just slightly and kissed my cheek. Her lips were warm.
Soft.
And when she pulled back, her eyes held something I couldn't name. "Good night, Jake." Then she got in the taxi. And just like before, she disappeared. Only this time, I knew better than to chase her. Because Sophie? She had always been someone meant to leave. And me? I had finally learned how to let her go. I didn't see Sophie again for weeks. At first, I thought that night at the bar would be the last time. A strange, unexpected collision of two people who had spent years trying to outrun the past. But then, one evening, I found myself in Brooklyn. It wasn't on purpose. That's what I told myself, anyway. I had been working on a story, a feature about small businesses surviving against the odds in a post-pandemic economy. Brooklyn was full of them, and I had already interviewed a handful of shop owners. And yet, somehow, my feet led me here. To her cafe. It was a small place tucked between a vintage bookstore and a record shop, the kind of spot that blended into the city if you weren't looking for it. Wild Clover. That was the name, written in delicate gold letters across the window. I stood outside for a moment, hands in my pockets, trying to decide if this was a mistake. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped inside. A bell jingled as I pushed the door open, and the scent of coffee and vanilla filled the air. It was warm, inviting, just like I imagined her place would be. A few customers sat at wooden tables, lost in their laptops and books, the low hum of conversation mixing with the jazz playing from a record player in the corner. And then, there she was, behind the counter, tying her apron, her hair pulled into a loose bun.
Sophie.
I hadn't been prepared for how natural she looked here. She belonged to this place in a way she had never belonged to Chicago, in a way she had never belonged anywhere when we were kids. She was happy here. I should have turned around. Should have walked away before she saw me. But it was too late. Because she looked up, and our eyes met. For a second, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she smiled. Not the polite, guarded smile from the bar that night. This one was real. Jake. Her voice was soft, warm, like the way she used to say my name when we were kids, sitting on that old porch, when she still let me close. I swallowed hard. "Hey." She wiped her hands on a towel and stepped around the counter. "What are you doing here?" I hesitated. I didn't have an answer. Because I was in the neighborhood would have been a lie. Because I couldn't stop thinking about you would have been the truth. So instead, I shrugged. "Just checking out Brooklyn." Her lips twitched. "And you just happened to walk into my cafe?" I smirked. "You always said I had a bad sense of direction." She laughed. And damn it, that laugh. I had missed that laugh. "Come on," she said, nodding toward a table by the window. "You want coffee? Only if you're making it." She rolled her eyes but turned back toward the counter, grabbing a mug and filling it with something rich and dark before setting it in front of me. I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting the warmth sink into my fingers, grounding me. She sat down across from me, resting her elbows on the table, studying me like she was trying to piece together why I was really here. "So," she said, tilting her head slightly, "what's the story, Miller?" I chuckled. "You always did know when I was hiding something." Her lips curved. "It's a gift." I exhaled. "I don't know. Guess I just wanted to see you again." She went quiet at that. Then, after a moment, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "I wanted to see you too." The cafe started to empty as the evening wore on. She closed up early, flipping the sign to closed, then grabbed 2 more mugs of coffee before sitting back down. For the first time in 2 decades, we weren't 2 strangers running into each other in a crowded bar. We were just Jake and Sophie again. 2 people with too much history and too many words left unsaid. "So," she said, leaning back in her chair, "tell me." I frowned. "Tell you what?" Her gaze was steady. What happened after I left? I huffed a small laugh. You mean after you disappeared without a word? She winced slightly. Yeah. I leaned back, exhaling. I was a mess for a while. Her fingers tightened slightly around her mug, but she didn't look away. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my jaw. I went to college, started writing, moved around a lot. And love, she asked. I chuckled dryly. A few people. Nothing that stuck. She nodded slowly. Yeah. I studied her. And you? After you left. She took a sip of coffee before answering. I married the wrong guy, she admitted, setting her mug down. I think I knew it from the start, but I wanted to believe it would work. I stayed quiet, waiting. She sighed. We were together for 10 years. He was a good man, but we were never right for each other. And when it ended, I don't know. It just made sense. I frowned. Kids. She shook her head.
No. Just me.
Something tightened in my chest. She had built a life. She had fallen in love, gotten married, started over. And yet here we were, sitting in her cafe, drinking coffee like we hadn't lost 20 years. Like she hadn't broken my heart. Like I wouldn't let her do it again. By the time we left the cafe, it was dark. We walked down the quiet Brooklyn streets, the city lights flickering in the distance. Neither of us spoke. But the silence wasn't heavy. It was easy, like we had all the time in the world. I glanced at her, at the way the neon glow from the corner store lit up her face. She caught me looking. What? She asked. I shook my head, smiling slightly. You still wrinkle your nose when you're thinking. She laughed. And you still smirk when you're trying to be charming. Is it working? She bit her lip, looking away. Maybe. My heart did something stupid. Because I knew how this ended. I had seen this movie before. But still, I reached for her hand. And for the first time in 20 years, she let me hold it. The city was quiet. For New York, that was rare. Sophie and I walked side by side down the Brooklyn streets, her hand still loosely resting in mine. It was strange how easy it felt. How natural. Like time hadn't taken 20 years from us. But time had. And no matter how much I wanted to ignore it, I couldn't. This feels weird, she murmured after a while. I glanced at her. Weird how? She exhaled, kicking a loose pebble on the sidewalk. Like déjà vu. I knew what she meant. We had been here before. Not in Brooklyn, not as adults. But once, a long time ago, on a quiet street in Chicago, we had walked like this. With the same kind of hesitation, the same kind of tension humming between us. And back then, it hadn't ended the way I wanted. I squeezed her hand slightly. She didn't pull away. So, what do we do about that? I asked. She smiled faintly. I don't know. Maybe nothing. That wasn't the answer I wanted. But I didn't push. Because Sophie had always been someone who left. And if she was going to stay, it had to be because she wanted to, not because I asked her to. We walked until we reached her apartment building. A quiet brownstone, the kind of place that suited her.
Warm.
Lived in. She stopped in front of the steps, turning to face me.
This is me, she said.
I nodded, shoving my hands into my pockets. Yeah. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, she inhaled deeply. Jake. I swallowed. Yeah. She hesitated. Then softer. What are we doing? I chuckled under my breath. I don't know, but I don't want to stop. Her eyes searched mine. You sure about that? I stepped closer. I've never been more sure of anything. For a moment, I thought she was going to kiss me. And maybe she thought so too. But then she pulled back slightly, exhaling a quiet laugh. God, we're idiots. I smirked. Maybe. She shook her head, smiling. You want to come up? The question sent something sharp through my chest. I had imagined this moment before, had played out every possible way it could go. And yet, now that I was here, I realized I didn't want it to be just another night. Not with her. So I shook my head. Her brows furrowed slightly. No. I want more than one night, Sophie. She blinked. What? I swallowed hard. I want this to mean something. And if I walk upstairs with you, I don't know what happens in the morning. I don't know if you'll disappear again. If we'll just call this a mistake and move on. Her expression softened. I ran a hand through my hair. I don't want this to be a mistake.
She was quiet for a long time.
Then, finally, she nodded. Okay. I exhaled, relieved. She smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't guarded. You'll call me? She asked. I smirked. You think I'd walk away from this after 20 years? She laughed. I guess not. I took a step back. Good night, Sophie. Her gaze lingered on mine. Good night, Jake. Then, before she could change her mind, before I could change mine, I turned and walked away. And for the first time I knew, this wasn't the end. Not this time. 1 week later, I showed up at her cafe again. She was behind the counter, pouring coffee, her hair loose around her shoulders. When she saw me, she smiled. Not the kind of smile that said, "What are you doing here?" Not the kind of smile that said this was a mistake. Just a simple, quiet smile. A smile that said, "I'm glad you came back." I sat down at the counter. She slid a cup of coffee in front of me. You never could stay away, could you? I grinned, wrapping my fingers around the cup. Guess not. And just like that, we started again. Not as 17-year-olds. Not as strangers. But as two people who had finally found their way back. This time, neither of us was leaving.